In this video, we are going to look at Docker volumes in practice. And this is a simple Node.js MongoDB application that we're going to attach the volume to so that we don't lose the database data every time we restart the MongoDB container. So let's head over to the console, and I'm going to start the MongoDB with the Docker Compose. So this is how the Docker Compose looks like. We're going to start the MongoDB container and the Mongo Express container so that we have a UI to it. So I'm going to execute the Docker Compose, which is going to start MongoDB and the Mongo Express. So once it has started, I'm going to check Mongo Express that it's running on port we configured in the Docker Compose file. And here we see just the same default databases again when we start the app. And we're going to create our own one once again for our Node.js application. And again, inside of the database, I'm going to create the users collection. So these are the prerequisites, or these are the things that my Node.js application needs. So this one here. And here, in order to connect to the database, we use a variable here called database name, which will match the database we have just created here. And inside of that, we set the collection name to match the name of the collection that we have created. So let's start the application by moving into the directory that our server.js file is saved. Then we're going to run npm install and then run node server.js command, which will start our application on port 3000. So here, and this is our app, which when I edit something here, will write the changes to my database. Now, if I were to recreate the MongoDB container, I would lose all the data. So because of that, we're going to use named volumes inside of the Docker Compose file to persist all this data in the MongoDB. Let's head over to the Docker Compose. So the first step is to define what volumes I'm going to be using in any of my containers. And I'm going to do that on the services level. So here, I define the list of all the volumes that I'm going to need in any of my containers. And since we need data persistence for MongoDB, we're going to create a Mongo data volume here. Now, this is going to be the name of the volume reference, but we also need to provide here a driver, local. So the actual storage path that we're going to see later once it's created is actually created by Docker itself. And this is a kind of an additional information for Docker to create that physical storage on a local file system. So once we have a name reference to the volume defined, we can actually use it in the container. So here, I'm going to say volumes. And here I will define a mapping between the Mongo data volume that we have on our host. And the second one will be the path inside of the MongoDB container. It has to be the path where MongoDB explicitly persists its data. So for example, if you check it out online, you see that the default path where MongoDB stores its data is data/data/db. And we can actually check that out. So if I say docker ps and go inside the container, it's -it. I can actually see data db. And here is all the data that MongoDB actually holds. But this is, of course, only the container. So when the container restarts, the data get regenerated. So nothing persists here. So this is the path inside of the container, not on my host, that we need to reference in the volumes here. So we're attaching our volume on the host to data/data/db inside of a container. So for example, for MySQL, it's going to be var lib MySQL. For Postgres, it's also going to be var lib PostgreSQL/data. So each database will have its own, so you'd have to actually find the right one. So what this means is that all the data that we just saw here, all of this will be replicated on a container startup on our host, on this persistent volume that we defined here, and vice versa. Meaning when a container restarts, all the data that is here will be replicated inside of that directory inside of a container. So now that we have defined that, let's actually restart the Docker Compose. And restart it. So once we create the data, and I'm going to use the collection, and let's actually change this one. Let's travel here and update it. So we have the data here. So now that we have the persistent volume defined, if I were to recreate all these containers, these data should be persisted. So on the next restart, I should see the database, my DB collection, and the entry here. So let's do that. So when I do Docker Compose down, it will remove or delete the containers. So those containers are gone. And when we do Docker Compose up, it will create completely new, fresh containers again with the same names. But since we have defined the volumes, it will actually attach the volume storage on local device to the newly started MongoDB container and replicate its data inside the container. And that's how the container gets the previously saved data, and we achieve data persistence in our database container. So if we go back, as you see, the database is here, the collection is here, and the entry has persisted. So now let's actually see where the Docker volumes are located on our local machine. And that actually differs between the operating systems. For example, on a Windows laptop or a computer, the path of the Docker volume will be at program data docker/volumes. The program data Docker folder actually contains all the other container information. So you would see other folders in this Docker directory besides the volumes. On Linux, the path is actually /var lib docker volumes, which is comparable to the Windows path. So this is where the Docker saves all this configuration and the data. And on the Mac, it's also the same one. Inside of this volumes directory, you actually have a list of all the volumes that one or many containers are using. And each volume has its own hash, which has to be unique. And then /_data will actually contain all the files and all the data that is persisted. Let's head over to the command line and actually see the volumes that we persisted for MongoDB. Now, an interesting note here is that if I were to go to this path that I just showed you in the presentation, which is var lib docker, see there is no such a directory. So that could be a little bit confusing. But the way it works on Mac specifically, on Linux, you would actually have that path directly on your host. But on Mac, it's a little bit different. So basically with Docker for Mac, we need to execute this command here, which will allow us to enter the shell of the Docker VM that the container is using. So we can view the Docker data about the containers and its volumes, for example. This is different from running Docker exec using the container ID, as this will start up a new container and allow us to connect to it from here. But if I execute this command, I actually get the terminal of that VM. And inside here, if I look, I have a different virtual file system. And I can find that path that I showed you here. So it's var lib docker. See, so I have all this Docker information here. I have the containers folder and I have volumes folder. So this is the one we need. So that let's actually go to the volumes. And this is a list of volumes that I have created. And this is the one that came from our Docker Compose, right? This is the name of our app. This is what Docker Compose actually takes as the name. We can actually take a look here. So when it's creating these containers, it appends this name as a prefix, and then there is MongoDB. And our volume has the same pattern. It has the prefix, and then MongoData, this is the name that we defined here. So now, if we look inside of that MongoData volume directory, we see that underscore data. This would be the anonymous volumes. So basically here you don't have a name reference, it's just some random unique ID, but it's the same kind of directory as this one here. The difference being that this one has a name. So it's easier to reference it with a name. So this is anonymous volume, this is a named volume. But the contents will be used in the same way. So here, as you see in this underscore data, we have all the data that MongoDB uses. So this will be where it gets the default databases and the changes that we make through our application inside. And if I go inside of the container, so remember this volume is attached to MongoDB and is replicated inside of the container under path /data/db. So if we go inside of the container, actually right here, look at PS. /db, we'll see actually the same kind of data here. So we have all this index and collection files, just like we did in this one. So now whenever we make changes to our application, for example, we change it to Smith, whatever, and this will make the container update its data, and that will cascade into this volumes directory that we have here. So that on the next startup of a container, when the /data/db is totally empty, it will actually populate this directory with the data from this persistent volume, so that we will see all the data that we created through our application again on startup. And that's how Docker volumes work.